And so I think it kind of goes back to like what we're talking about when it comes to preaching and teaching. You might feel this burden or pressure to be dynamic or have a unique take on something, or have a clever something one-liner that's tweetable, when in reality you think like, I want to play the long game, and I want to love my kids in 30 years and 40 years. I want my wife to love me. I want to love my wife. And I think to play the long game, we as preachers have to develop the character side, have to develop the heart side, have to maybe take, even like emphasize less of, what is preaching, how to preach, some of these things that are beautiful, we need to study, we need to know. But I think just emphasizing just our own spiritual walk, enjoying the Lord, because I think, again, that will make it real. That'll make it sincere. I think that's where you see like the favor of God just kind of rest on people when it's, just genuine.
Well, hi, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast, episode 178. I'm your host, Mike Neglia, and thank you so much for listening. Well, the voice that you just heard is that of Pastor Josiah Graves. He's a pastor of the Exchange Church in Deerfield Beach in South Florida. And in this conversation, we kind of move beyond the tips and the tricks, the life hacks about preaching. And Josiah really focuses on the important issues of the character and the heart and the rhythms of the life of the preacher beyond just the act of sermon prep and delivering the sermon. So we think all of that's important, and I'm really thankful to have not only the ins and outs and nuts and bolts of sermon prep, but also from time to time to be addressed and to be encouraged about the character of us as preachers ourselves. So I know that you're going to enjoy this episode. You're going to be invited at the end by Nick Cady to our in-person training event, which is taking place in Colorado in September. Do stick around for that, and I would love to see you there in person. All right, here's this conversation, and I hope that this episode and all that we do at the Expositors Collective helps you to grow in your personal study and your public proclamation of God's Word. Well, hey, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast. I'm here with Josiah Graves from the Exchange Church. Hey, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on the Expositors Collective Podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I think I said Expositors Collective Podcast 2 times in one sentence. So I just want to make sure people know what they're listening to, Hey, so Josiah, I'm just going to dive straight into it. The very first question, I think, kind of gives people a glimpse into your life and your story. So can you just tell us like your first sermon that you ever preached? How did it go? What was it like?
Yeah, of course. So, I was actually in high school. My first sermon I preached, I grew up in Southern California. I went to Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, went to the high school there. And during the summertime, a couple of my friends, they had like this home Bible study. So Ben Corson, Tyler Branch, a couple of these guys would lead this Bible study at John Corson's house. And so all summer long, I was going there, like loved it, really enjoyed it. I think it might have been like, I forget, my junior year, maybe going into my junior year. So I was like 16. They took a break from the Bible study, and I was like really sad. I was like, oh, I love this. So I talked to Ben about it, and I said, hey, can I do this study, invite some people to another friend of ours' house? So we went to this house like in the Newport Coast area, beautiful house, beautiful location. And man, I remember just being terrified. I mean, I'm 16. I can't even call this a first sermon, But for me, I feel like the gospel really just started to register around that time, where I got really passionate about it. I was like, kind of doing my thing for a while when it comes to like, going through the motions of the Christian walk, kind of in, but not really. I wanted to also kind of do my own thing. And then I remember hearing a sermon from John Corson on 2 Corinthians 5:21. He called it the Great Switcheroo. And I remember how much that impacted me, man. Like that to me was the gospel. And it was so freeing, so clear. I've heard the gospel tens of thousands of times, but for whatever it was that day, I'm all in. So it was like going into that summer, I was just so passionate about it. They had these Bible studies. All I remember is they would like read a verse, tell some stories, give some comments, pray it out. And I didn't really know what I was doing. So kind of did the same thing. I remember I read a verse. told a story that I thought was great, wasn't probably that great, and then gave some commentary that probably wasn't the most biblical or exegetical, and kind of forgot what I was going to say for maybe first 5-10 minutes, and it was a mess. Like, it was truly a nightmare. But everyone's very encouraging. Everyone's very, nice about it. And I can't say from there I was hooked, but I think from there I was like, got passionate about wanting to clearly explain the word like I heard. That was more of the passion.
Well, how many people were there? Was it all teenagers? And were they like sympathetic, it sounds like, or encouraging? You said?
Yeah, it's probably like, juniors and seniors in high school, maybe 15 to 20 of them. Okay. That's my first memory of preaching, in the sense of, 15, 20 people is not really like a large gathering or anything. It's more like a small group, but it was kind of treated like a preaching, kind of like worship and teaching,
Yeah. So it was not like an interactive discussion. It was a monologue.
Yeah. I mean, I think we try to make it, have food, hang out, worship. I just kind of try to copy what I saw. I try to copy what I saw at Ben's house the last summer or two.
Right.
So probably started that way. And then actually, I think the first time I really preached was right after I graduated. Like, hey, do you want to come back and do a chapel? And I'm like, why would you? And it didn't make sense to me. I'm like, no, I don't know. And I remember getting up there, and man, so it's probably in front of former classmates, in a sense, like they're just a grade below me. And I remember getting up there, and I literally just said nothing. I tried to say thank you for having me, and I think I just got up there and said something in a different language, and then prayed. And so that was the second time, so it got even better.
Oh man. Oh, okay. Well, that's great. I'm excited. Here's what my ears really perked up at when you were talking about how there was kind of like a bit of like a gospel awakening in your life that took place right before your first sermon, and that it was kind of based on a teaching that you heard on Corinthians 5:21, 2 Corinthians 5:21. Yeah. Tell us about that. That's exciting. I want to hear about that.
Yeah, it's funny. So our church is actually called The Exchange, and in many ways,
noticed that. Yeah, I noticed that. I was like, why did this church call it the Great Switcheroo?
Yeah, in many ways, it was to kind of go back to that. For us, it's just the gospel in a word. Obviously, you have Spurgeon, the Great Exchange, and for John, the famous one to me was the Great Switcheroo. And so, we're called The Exchange simply because when people ask, what is that? Like a moving company? And we're like, hey, it's our church, but it's what Jesus did for us in a word, and honestly, just the idea of substitution was really profound to me at the, not at the time, but still is, but it was very revolutionary to me. I've heard the gospel, but just the simplicity and yet the profoundness of the great exchange, of the switch that happened, to me, it was so freeing because, you do try to model what you see. And so I think religion was something I'll try to do these things. I'll try to read, I'll try to pray, I'll try to be good. And it got exhausting. And then you kind of go the other way and you try to do your own thing and you just kind of want to have fun, and sin's there. And then when you hear the gospel of just the great exchange, that I didn't work for it, I didn't earn it, I didn't pay for it. It was just so free. And I was like, does everyone know this? I know this, but I don't think I've heard it like this. So it was based off 2 Corinthians 5:21, even 2 Corinthians 8:9. God, who is rich, became poor so that you through his poverty might become rich. And it was just so free. And it's like, wow, God, you entered my poverty and I entered your wealth. I entered your salvation wealth, your heavenly wealth. And it was just so freeing.
Oh man. I love to hear that. And obviously, it impacted for decades on afterwards. Well, I guess speaking of kind of ongoing impact, the next kind of question is so Josiah, how have you kind of grown since then? You obviously are able to open your mouth and say words now. So that's good.
Yeah.
You've been able to say, thank you for having me. And it comes out in English, but what are some maybe moments in your let's say preaching career, if you want to use that kind of language, or in the past 15 years of teaching and preaching, what have been times when you've you really have sensed a change or growth, or, by God's grace have had some progress in your teaching and preaching?
Yeah. I think for so long, every young preacher, you kind of imitate, right? And in some ways it's not bad. Paul does say, imitate me. And I think there's something about, wanting to imitate those you respect, those you admire. So I think for a while I was just trying to find my voice, like a lot of people, even still to this day. I think you can kind of get into these seasons where you kind of fall in love with a certain type of preacher or dynamic, and And maybe just through osmosis or just through listening a lot, to be honest, you kind of begin to share or preach like that.
Yeah.
And so for a while, it's just, you're trying to find that. But I think like as you pursue personally, like, as you pursue the heart of Jesus, as you really are trying to, experience it, like really trying to live it out before you preach it, you do begin to find your voice. You do begin to make connections. You begin to think about it in such a way where it's like, it's starting to become your own. I think it's Martin Lloyd-Jones who said something to the effect of, every preacher needs to begin a sermon not at their desk, but on their knees. And I wrote that in the front cover of my Bible, something to that effect. And that just stuck with me of like, okay, like this is not so much about even the act of preaching as much as like, I need to commune with God. I need to like, let this message register in my heart. And then when it comes out, it's clear, it's passionate. It's not like you have to check your notes every 5 seconds. It's like, because it's almost like, how Paul says to the Corinthians, like, you're written on our hearts. You must feel like the message has been written on your heart, or the people that you're preaching to is written on your heart. So it comes out a lot more clearly, smoothly, because you genuinely care for the people. And I think what happens is you're trying to find your voice, or maybe it's more about the act of preaching and teaching rather than it is like developing a passion and love for the people you're preaching to. And the more we develop this love for the people we're preaching to, I think it just comes out a lot more smoothly and naturally.
So somebody's listening to this and maybe they're thinking, well, Josiah, I do love my people, but I can't help but checking my notes every 5 seconds. Or, well, I do pray, I guess, before I prep the sermon, but yet I'm not able to speak with this kind of like passion and fervor that you have. Anything for that frustrated listener right now?
Yeah. I mean, we've all been there. We still go there. Yeah. I really do think that, like, for me at least, I think everyone has to, again, find kind of their rhythm. Like, it is fun to learn how different people study, how different people maybe leave their PowerPoints or notes in their Bible. Like, it's cool to learn what, this person uses an iPad, this person's old school, they don't need notes. I don't know. It's kind of like cool to see that. But for me, I think what I found was I still do this somewhat. Like, I like to write out my sermon. I like to pray through it as I do. I like to, sit with it and like look at something I wrote out and it's like, that's not it, and cross it out. But I think as I kind of like pray over each section, that really has helped me I think the hard dynamic in preaching sometimes is like connecting one thought to the next. It's kind of being that like bridge, like, how do I go from here to here? And I think when you're praying through that, as you look at your notes, you go, oh, this is the connection. This is how I can jump from this thought to this thought. And it almost seems seamless. Now, it's not always like that, but I think that some of the best preachers I've heard, and probably you've heard, are guys who are like, they lead you along this journey and you don't even know they're changing thoughts, but they probably, and Paul does it in his writing, where like, he'll have like 11 verses, like one long sentence, one long thought. There's probably 20 points there, but the other's like 1 point. And I think you kind of see that in preaching sometimes, is when there's like a seamless, one thought to the next, because there's one overarching theme or point they're trying to get across.
Yeah. And that's beautiful. That's really great to see. Yeah. And yeah, like the act of, I don't know, pivoting from one thought to the next. It is kind of a skill. It is something that, takes some effort and some work into it. Oftentimes, how many sermons have we heard where it's just like, and that's the end of verse 1, and now starting verse 2. But there's that, flowing from the one to the next, and then, or saying, and but you conclude your first point and you say, but that raises a question, doesn't it? And the question that we have about this is, well, what about this? Well, guys, look at the next verse. And you kind of are bringing people from one thing into the next, and maybe not having to glance at the notes every single second, because it's really clear to us. And so we're able to communicate that to others.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
And I don't know who said it. I've heard it from many different people, but yeah, a mist in the pulpit is a fog in the pew. Mm-hmm. So if it's not crystal clear to us, what it is we're saying, why we're saying it in this order, if it's not clear to us, then we're really asking a lot of our hearers to just kind of make sense of it,
Yes.
Just like giving a bunch of ingredients and say, hey, here you go, just do something with it.
Yes, no, I agree. I really agree with that. And again, I think just kind of learning from different people, even different denominations, like how do they do the act of preaching? Like, how do they start? How do they begin? How do they how do they, kind of connect some points or thoughts and end. But, because I think early on for me, like I really enjoyed so Tim Chaddick, who did Reality LA and did Reality London, he was the guy I feel like that really showed me. He kind of gave 2 intros to every sermon. There's kind of like an intro maybe before reading, here's where we're going, here's some of the big thoughts today, or maybe it's even some small talk to maybe get comfortable, and then like reading, or maybe the passage, and then there was like the intro that would just captivate everyone. And I do like that, because I like the idea of like bringing context, like welcome, here's where we're at in the word today, or here's what we're going through, and almost like giving people some context who are maybe just there that first week. But then and you read the scripture, and I love the like captivating intro that just brings you into the heart of whatever the author's point is, just bring you into the heart of the passage. So I think that 2 intro thing has helped me. I don't do it every time, but I do enjoy that, because I think I think we got to ask questions that like, what captivates what do I listen to? What do I like? And I think, it's almost like what I want to listen to myself, and probably a lot of times not. But the idea is like, would I be captivated by this? So the person who's coming in for the first time, do I have like different on-ramps for them where they can just kind of get into the message right away? Even an untrained ear, or just like a non-believing ear, they can hop right in and go, oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. Yeah. The term on-ramp is so useful, because people have shown up to church, or they've tuned into the live stream or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're there and like the highlight of their week or the highlight of their morning is going to be paying attention to your sermon. And that's okay. Like, we just got to realize that's just how it is, but we want to make it as easy as possible with as little barriers. Not that we water down the message. We certainly don't want to do that, but we do want to make it as like accessible. At least if people are going to reject the message, at least let them hear it in the first place by making it easy for them to listen to.
Mm-hmm. No, I so agree. I think I'm trying to remember if it's in Acts 14. I'm trying to remember the passage, but basically talking about we got to make it easy for them to listen. Like we got to make it almost palpable. Sometimes I think we try to use big words, or we try to use like systematic theology terms or whatever it might be to try to like show people like we're studied, we're learned. And I fall into that trap. And just defining some things a little bit, just even maybe putting it up behind you so people can see like, what do you mean when we say theology, like what the heck are you talking about? Just kind of like, again, I think, we want to have it, I guess where it can be all levels. So, I mean, John Corson has this thing, and I'm sure you've heard it, maybe you talked about on this podcast, but he has like every sermon should include milk, meat, manna. Milk might be just the pure gospel of the word. It might be the simple things that newborn babe drinks, like a story, an analogy, something anyone can kind of be captivated with, but it's also gospel. Meat is maybe that substance, that depth, that, wow, that's I haven't seen it or looked at it that way. And then manna might be that heavenly bread, right? So it's like that something sweet, something like you and the Lord have kind of, you process with him. And just maybe it's an insight that's like, just like, that's good. Like that's personal. That's even for my church, for my community. Now it's not like a perfect thing, but I do think like that milk, meat, manna idea has been somewhat helpful, or a decent framework, or one of many tools I think to approach when it comes to preaching.
Yeah, it's good to that. Yeah, I love it. And it has been mentioned before, but that was like a year plus. So it's really good to have that, because even to have some sort of rubric, or sorry, you just said to not use sophisticated words, some kind of a grid, Mm-hmm. We don't want to just reduce everything to just some kind of a formula. However, it's good to look at like your printed out final draft and say, hey, is there something in here that like a brand new Christian would get? Mm-hmm. Is there something that's a little bit more challenging? And then is there anything that comes out of like, my living vital relationship with Jesus? Has any of that spilled onto here? And yes. So it's a good thing. Maybe there's other, quadrants that you could run it through, but I think that one's really helpful. It's very memorable. It's very, very good and useful.
Yeah. And again, it's not even about like we can't use certain words. I think it's just we should define them, right? Like, I think if I hear people like, oh, Paul had this eschatological mindset. Like, yeah, he did. Like, but can you explain that? Can you say that, or define it a little bit? Whatever, it's just nice to. And again, I can fall into that same trap, because I'm like, well, I defined it last month and I don't want to do it again. But we always got to be just aware of that person coming in, and just in any capacity,
Totally. Because people are not like binge listening to our sermons.
Yes.
Like we are not as interesting as Netflix, so we're not going to get binged. I know maybe someone does, maybe somebody is, but yeah, just because you said something even last week doesn't mean people remember it. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. Mm-hmm. So it's useful to once something's been, what somebody else said this, he said, by the time that the preacher is sick and tired of saying something, mm-hmm. that's when most of the church has finally got it. Mm-hmm. So even to have, a cheesy phrase or a vision statement or mm-hmm. the theme of the book, mm-hmm. You can't just unveil, mm-hmm. let's say the church's mission or vision or values in your annual vision Sunday. It's got to come through all the time, because just because you say it once doesn't mean people actually truly get it.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something we try to do even with just leadership. Like my main, we call them our ministry leads, but I might feel like I'm sick and tired of saying this to you, but again, like it might be the fourth or fifth time they're kind of getting like, oh, I need to pass this information on to my team leads, and I just think when it comes to preaching, teaching, same thing, like, because I can live my own head, like, oh, I've said this before, I've heard this before. In reality, it's probably most people's first time, really listening to it. And I think we got to kind of get out of our own heads. Yeah.
And this is not just, and I hope no one listens to this and hears two elitists talking back and forth about like our congregation so they don't get it. Like, didn't you say at the very beginning, you heard the gospel 10,000 times before it really landed on you? So we're talking about human nature, ourselves included, first and foremost, ourselves.
Absolutely. I mean, there is something about just like timing with maybe my heart wasn't ready for certain things. Maybe the Holy Spirit was just at work in a unique way. And just, I think when we pray, even coming to service with like this expectation, like, God, even if they've heard this hundreds of thousands of times, let it be brand new to them. It's almost like when I read Prodigal God like 8 years ago, right? This book by Tim Keller on the prodigal sons. I mean, a story I've heard, countless amount of times. And obviously, when you read through it, you're going, oh my gosh, I've never considered that elder brother in this way. That he was a prodigal, that he also was using the father, that he also was manipulating. There you go. I mean, and it's now I can't read it any other way, even though like I always read, and even just like noticing how it's when the scribes and Pharisees complained, that's when he gave these parables. So the context really is to this. And I just think it's so refreshing, because I've had people, who've been following Jesus for 30, 40 years kind of hear that, for example, and go, I've never heard that. And I'm like, first of all, I didn't discover it. That was someone else. But yes, like it's so beautiful when the word of God comes alive to you the 300th time you've heard it. And I think I think that's a hope I want to have. Like, God, I don't care if I've taught through this book before. Like I have, like, what do you want to show me? What is it I missed? What is it my heart wasn't ready for? Or my heart was in denial about?
Oh man. Yeah, I appreciate it. And then also I'm just kind of thinking as well, like, I remember the first time I ever heard Tim Keller teach the story, the prodigal sons, the mm-hmm. Distinction between the father, the older brother and the younger brother. And I think you and I, we've heard it loads of times, life-changing. And then I'm going to guess the majority of people that listen to this podcast, we're all kind of preaching nerds. We've probably heard it before. If not, there'll be a link in the show notes because you got to hear it. However, here's the thing though. So that was like a paradigm shifting thing for me, like literally paradigm shifting. And I'm not prone to hyperbole and I'm not using hyperbole. Wow. And it's made such a big impact to me. And then I could even just, use shorthand for this conversation. You can reference it and I get exactly what you mean. But also too, remember, maybe there's people in my church and they haven't heard that yet. And it's because like, I'm not talking about it because I assume, everyone has had this changed. So there's kind of going back to that idea of like repetition. It's just that, we need to repeat the things that are important. And then the things that have been big enough to change our lives, we got to make sure that like they get in regular rotation, that this type of insight goes out regularly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay.
Let's talk about like finding that voice of yours. You kind of had mentioned that at the beginning. You said you kind of borrowed from people or it's expected. And there is a degree of imitation that's like appropriate. How would you what would you say to your younger version of yourself that hadn't really discovered, his own voice yet? What advice would you give?
It's a great question. Man, in some ways it's like, just rest, rest. Don't stress, don't freak out over it. I think the more, I don't know, again, I think we can all live in our own heads, or, I don't know. I can be my worst critic, right? Like, speaking of Keller, he wrote that little book called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness, like a tiny little read. And that was one of those profound things. Like, Paul's like, I don't let others judge me. I don't even judge myself, right? Like, each man's judgment comes from God. And I think there's like that little voice from others that can really kind of eat at you. And I think there's a difference between, and we can talk about feedback, later, but not feedback, but just something that kind of either, the idea of praise can go to your head, and kind of criticism can go to your heart, right? And those two things, one can inflate me and one can deflate me. One can really make me think I'm something I'm not. One of the best things, actually, so I don't know if it's fully answering your question right now, but I preached a sermon. I was maybe 23, 24 at a summer camp. I was like a middle school and then high school pastor. So I might've been in that transition period, but it's awesome. Like, I feel like it's one of my best sermons. That sounds weird, but like, just went well, and it was clear, and it was truly like, I felt it, like, it's convicting. I felt like the Lord was in it. And, kids, I really do believe, like, committed their life. Even to this day, I still have some in my life that like really gave their life to the Lord, and it was awesome. Right. And I remember the next day, he wasn't our head pastor at the time, but he's now the head pastor at Calvary Fort Lauderdale, Doug Souter. He pulled me aside, and it's one of the best conversations. He pulls me aside and goes, listen, that was one of the best messages I've ever heard. And he's like, you need to preach that in a sanctuary at Fort Lauderdale if they ever let you. He's like, that was incredible. He goes, but that's not you. And you can't believe for a second that you get any of that praise from last night. And he's like, and I know that you want to believe that was you. And I don't know, it just like kind of like next 5 minutes just went off on me. and honestly, it was so good. Not even like, I didn't even feel like that got to my head. Like, I didn't even feel like it. I truly at that time felt humbled by being a part of it. But then, like, hearing him just call me out and kind of walk me through that was so good. That was so necessary. I was, there's a flesh of you that wants to be like, who are you to say this? But in reality, there's that little voice going, he's right. Like, and he's like, your wife knows the real you. I know the real you. And don't, you're not the sinless, he just kind of went off, and it was just so good. And I don't know, whatever it was, like, that did stick with me. That was like, really profound. And then there's another thing too. There was another pastor, actually at Calvary Costa Mesa. His name's Craig Coffin. He was a pastor that I remember, like, at 18. He's like, whenever you get done preaching, just find a lone space, get away, thank the Lord for that privilege, ask him to forgive you for anything that might have just been said from the flesh. Like, almost just like, get alone. Don't believe the criticism. Don't believe the praise. Just you and the Lord. And so I feel like those couple of things have been so helpful, navigating this process of finding your voice.
Yeah. Man, and what a gift to go back to the Florida camp experience, if it was in Florida. But I haven't met that guy, but I've heard really good things about. Sorry, what was his name again?
Doug Souter. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've heard really good things about him and his character, and that's just one more great thing. That like what wisdom? Like, I don't know, like, maybe there's a bit of swagger to your step the next day that he discerned, or maybe just a Holy Spirit thing or something.
Yeah.
But what a wonderful gift that like, I don't know, kind of just aligned you properly to experience, I guess. I heard someone was talking about, like, musicians, and it was saying that, like, failure will ruin a musician, but not nearly as much as success will ruin a musician.
Yeah. Same as true for preachers.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So maybe to catch you, as everyone's saying, Josiah has slain his thousands, or his tens of thousands. That's really good and wise counsel that you received.
And it's funny, going back to that guy. He still to this day leads out of character, leads out of integrity. He was that way 13 years ago when I met him, and just very consistent, very faithful. And I think it's a great example. And, just knowing, I really appreciate him. They obviously sent us out to plant, but, I think, like, we came out of a very dynamic culture, at least so I was on staff at Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale for almost 9 years. I think like 8.5 years, something like that. And, we came out of very dynamic preaching. It's all about the gifting. People came to watch because, it was very clever. It was just, almost like a show, right? And then Doug comes on and couldn't have been more different, but yet very captivating still in a different way. Like, there wasn't as much charisma or excitement, but it's like, you knew who he was, who his family was, his integrity, his character, the way he led was night and day different. And I think what people wanted to come was like, they wanted to be a part of something healthy. And, it's cool because, we've seen a lot of churches end over less matters than what we walk through. And yet I think God has been so faithful because I think he just honors that character, that faithfulness. And so I think it kind of goes back to like what we're talking about when it comes to preaching and teaching. You might feel this burden or pressure to be dynamic or have a unique take on something, or have a clever something one-liner that's tweetable, when in reality you think like, I want to play the long game and I want to love my kids in 30 years and 40 years. I want my wife to love me. I want to love my wife. And I think to play the long game, we as preachers have to develop the character side, have to develop the heart side, have to maybe take, even like emphasize less of, what is preaching, how to preach, some of these things that are beautiful, we need to study, we need to know. But I think just emphasizing just our own spiritual walk, enjoying the Lord. Because I think, again, that will make it real. That'll make it sincere. I think that's where you see like the favor of God just kind of rests on people when it's, just genuine. And and sometimes when you have like a preaching class, let's say, or maybe even you have like a cohort or something you're walking through, it's kind of like talked about like character and integrity, but, we'll first kind of get to like a Martin Lloyd-Jones Preaching and Preachers or Keller's book on preaching, and we'll go through that, and it's beautiful and it's awesome. But, you almost want to spend some time on like the preacher before the preaching, or spend some time on Jesus before the act of preaching itself,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's valuable. Yeah. The character, I was going to say the character piece or the character contribution, but I think we know that character is more than just one bit of the preacher's toolbox. We need to have our homiletics. We need to have our cultural observations. We need to have our rhyming alliteration. We need to have good character. But I think you agree that character is core and central, and these other things are useful. But the character is, we got to lead the way with our character.
Yeah, just we live in a very like it's obviously, I think social media and that kind of presence will only grow stronger and in so many different avenues. And, when someone falls, it feels like they fall harder, and so I feel like characters rarely celebrated, or like, just even someone who passes away and you're like, wow, they did it well for 50 years, and I think we celebrate a lot of times the wrong things. It's like, have you heard this person? Like, and that's not a bad question, but like, have you heard so-and-so? They're great. They're killing it. Versus like, man, have you spent time with so-and-so who's, 80 years old and truly been faithful, and his kids, his grandkids love the Lord. And like, we need to start valuing the things that truly matter. But, I don't know, that's just, it takes focus. And it's hard not to get caught up in that. It's hard not to get caught up in the newest thing. But how do we get caught up in like things that will, stay with us, character things, integrity things? It's kind of a lost art.
Absolutely. I got to spend time with a guy, and he's a good preacher. I don't want to name drop, but you got to eat dinner with him and his family, and I was just like, I was like, you know what, like he really loves his wife, and his kids really, really like respect him. Wow. And there's this like, I was just like, this is really great to see behind the curtain. And obviously there's a guest in the house, so I'm sure everyone's kind of on their best behavior, a little bit, but there's certain like levels of like trust, and and we held hands. It was pre-COVID. We held hands and sang a hymn before dinner.
Wow.
Like,
oh my goodness,
kind of like borderline cheesy, but wonderful. And again, you could tell the kids weren't like, Dad, why do we have to do this? Oh, there's a guest. Okay, like this is just what they did. It's just what they did. Wow. It was really, really wonderful.
So I have a lot of repenting to do right now, because usually when a guest is over, my kids are like, this is my friend. They're here for me, not you, Dad. And it's, I have some things to work on.
Sure. Well, before you do that, can you tell us about your weekly sermon prep rhythm? So you're in like 2 Corinthians right now, or sorry, I say you're in 2 Corinthians.
Yes.
Ireland, 2 Corinthians, but America says so.
I like it. Well,
and I heard your last sermon. Your last sermon was on 2 Corinthians 4, right?
We just
that's the latest on the podcast feed anyway.
Yeah, we just finished the chapter. I'm not sure. Maybe you heard verse 1 through 6. I don't know, but yeah. So I mean, this year's been different for us. Not that you have to do this. I think everyone has to kind of find their thing. But just for us coming out of 2020, we kind of viewed this year as like the year of spiritual health. Almost like that's what we've talked about as a church. So like we try to just emphasize that. We're going over emotionally healthy leaders with some of our leaders. It's a book by Pete Scazzaro. Like we're just kind of going through some of these things. We're doing emotionally healthy relationships as a church right now. We're just starting that out right now in the month of June. So we're trying to like focus on spiritual and emotional health. So we actually did do like the 7 churches of Revelation. We did that just to kind of like, hey, this is Jesus speaking to the church, the good and the bad and the ugly, like all of it. And then we did like a 5-week series on like, what is the church, and now we're walking through a book of the Bible verse by verse. We do like to mix it up in some ways, like almost like that prophetic, like what does our church right now need to hear? I mean, this, like 2020 was weird. I don't know we're still going to be like kind of like walking with a limp from that for a while. And man, like, I've never seen even in our own church, like we're a small church, maybe 150 adults on the weekends, and I look at our church and I go, man, there's so much division over just, to me, just way secondary issues. And so we're kind of looking at this, like, how do we detox some of that? How do we do relationships well? How do we do forgiveness well? So we are approaching 2 Corinthians kind of with that mindset of like a new way to live, a new way to do life, a new way to do relationships, like obviously kind of based off, we're a new creation. So with that comes everything, a new family, new dynamics, everything. So that's kind of how we want to approach, like, for the person who's just walking in, they're like, why are they walking through 2 Corinthians? Why are they walking through that?
Hey, thank you. I appreciate that.
There you go.
Thanks for accommodating me.
Yeah. We want to kind of answer that question. Like, why are you doing that? And so we're going, hey, we're doing this because we know as followers of Jesus, there is a new way to do life. There's a new way to live. And there's so many books of the Bible that you could have done this with, but we just felt like this would be a good fit for us in this season. Just praying through it, looking at it. So all of that to say, like, I think before we just kind of like, at least for us, before we just kind of jump into a random book, we're trying to say, like, how does it fit our moment, our church, our culture, our needs? And there's so many, I don't know if you can go wrong. Obviously, we could have preached through, Haggai or something, and it would have fit in some way. But we just feel like this would have been this has been a good book so far, honestly, for us as a community.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear it. And in the remaining like 2.5 minutes,
yes,
how are you trying to improve? Like, how do you want to be a better preacher?
Yeah. It's so funny. I don't know. It's when you say, how do you want to improve? Like, obviously it's way more than outside of preaching.
Good points.
Like, I feel like, even obviously if this is the question, like, let's answer for those who are really interested in preaching. But at the same time, I feel like I Josiah, as a follower of Jesus, need to improve, and I think if I, as a husband, as a dad, if I can improve in these areas, it'll only help my preaching. Mm-hmm. And I think that in some ways, I can emphasize the preaching more than, like, again, the person, like the preacher. So, right now we're trying to get back to some spiritual discipline stuff. I'm very thankful for the last few years, how I just feel like, not in just even one denomination, but I feel like I've seen it on like a collective global level. Maybe not global, but at least here in the States, where you see this emphasis on spiritual formation. So John Ortberg, Dallas Willard, some of these books, I feel like our church has been going back to. I think we realize we've been obsessing over things, like, are stealing our time, our energy, our money. They're just stealing everything away. So, we've been trying to get to back to like the practices of engagement and the practices of disengagement. And so without me just saying that, like, we're trying to say, how do we disengage? Silence, solitude, maybe prayer. Just how do we go on walks again? How do we go to the beach again? How do we just enjoy the Lord again? And then engagement. Like, I need to be in community, and I need to be a part of my church body, not just say, hey guys, you should be in a small group. So just trying to like engage in that way. I feel like those things have just helped me as a preacher, even though it's not directly, dealing with preaching. So I think, I think we can kind of get the cart in front of the horse kind of a thing when it comes to preaching. Because we talked about this right before we started, but just, Paul in 1 Corinthians 4 said, like, though you have 10,000 instructors, there's not many fathers among you. And my thing is, I think we do a really good job of creating teachers, preachers, instructors, but are we discipling or molding fathers? So again, I'm not a father I can't claim that yet. I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. Like, it's crazy to me. Like I would like to be a father in the
you
faith.
are a father, you know?
I'm a father, right?
I mean, I hate to break it to you, man.
Are you sure? Yeah. No, I guess it can't. But I mean, just like that kind of like that figure, right? That father figure where you're just like, wow, like they've been at it for 30, 40 years, just faithfully following Jesus. So I think we do live in a culture where we make really good preachers and teachers, but do we live in a culture where we're making really good future fathers? Wow. So though you have 10,000 instructors, you can get, and this is a great podcast. You can find hundreds like it, right? But are we developing a culture where we're trying to create fathers in the faith? And that's a challenge to me and our leaders. And like, am I modeling it? And am I creating an environment where we're building up future fathers in the faith?
Yeah, so valuable. I mean, it all really comes back to what you were saying earlier on, that like if character truly is core, in order for you to improve as a preacher, you want to be feeding into those character forming aspects of your own life. So that's valuable. Well, Josiah, we got to go. Thank you so much for your time. I've loved getting to speak to you and to know you better. And once again, may the Lord bless you. I hope that this episode and all that we do at the Expositors Collective helps you to grow in your personal study and your public proclamation of God's Word. All right, thanks.
Amen. Thank you.
This is Nick Cady inviting you to the Expositors Collective Training Weekend coming up on September 17th and 18th in Colorado Springs, Colorado. This will be our first in-person gathering since the pandemic, and we are so excited to get together again for this 24-hour immersive experience, which will help you grow in your private study and your public proclamation of God's Word. We also have an option this time for you to join us online if you aren't able to come in person. This event is open to men and women ages 18 through 34 who want to grow in their ability to preach and teach the Bible. We'll have everything from outlining help to sermon prep resources. We'll be learning in small groups with hands-on application and help from seasoned Bible teachers. You don't want to miss it. September 17th and 18th in Colorado Springs. More information and registration is available on our website, expositorscollective.com. Hope to see you there.